Live.
Hello, everyone. Let me just adjust something here. Something's broken. Okay. Well, hello. So we have come to the end of our 14-week journey to study the 12 chapters of a new kind of science. And this is, we had timed this so that this would coincide with the 20th anniversary of the publication of this book. And that the official 20th anniversary was Saturday, May 14th, 2022. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit today about two things. I want to tell you a little bit about the making of the book, and then a little bit about where I see the science in this book as going. And I just posted two writings in the past couple of days. One just now, about 20 years later, The Surprising Greater Implications of a New Kind of Science, and the other was called The Making of a New Kind of Science. And I want to talk a little bit about both of those, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's start off talking about so this is, I'm going to talk about this, The Making of a New Kind of Science, and how this book came to be. I also would like to say, let me show you something else here. That we have coming out later this year, this book, this is just a mock-up, I'm afraid, called 20 Years of a New Kind of Science, which will include some of the things I just posted and some other material, including a very nice gallery of NKS-based art. So, anyway, so that's something that's coming. And in addition to that, there is a, if I can show you at the end here, I hope. Oh, no. Oops. All right. Okay, not here. No, not what I wanted. Sorry. That's not what I wanted at all. Okay. Navigate correctly. Into this, maybe I can show you. Oh, yes, there we go. Another new thing coming in a few months is the box set of the original NKS book, together with the new 20 Years of a New Kind of Science and the physics book, Project to Find the Fundamental Theory of Physics. So that's another thing that I believe you can order as of now. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about, oh, was I showing you this? No, I wasn't showing you this. Oh dear, let me show you now. There's what I was just talking about. All right, so I want to talk a bit about how the book, New Kind of Science, came to be. And as I say, then so I'm going to talk about the making of the book. And this will dive fairly deep into the sort of practicalities of what was involved here. Hold on one second. I'm seeing something else is kind of broken here. Just a second. Okay. So I wanted to, so how did a New Kind of Science get to be written? So it was kind of a long journey, and the sort of initiation of the book itself was in the late 1980s, around 1989, 1990. But I should say, tell some of the backstory to that. So I started working on I've been working on traditional physics, particle physics, cosmology, and so on in the late 1970s, and had become sort of a card-carrying physicist. Then 1979, I built this thing called SMP, which is kind of a forerunner of Wolfram Language and Mathematica, that got more or less finished by the first version by 1981. So I kind of went from pure basic science of physics to creating a computational system that was originally for the purpose of doing, being able to do the kinds of computations one needs to do in physics. But I sort of quickly went to the place where I was trying to sort of understand with as much clarity as possible what was this thing of computation that we were trying to make use of in this tool. And that sort of led me to understand a lot about kind of the foundations of computation in the building of SMP. And SMP is a symbolic system that is based on transformation rules between expressions, very much like Wolfram Language, except the design was not as sleek as Wolfram Language. And that's what happens when you do it first, so to speak. And then I got to do it a second time with Wolfram Language and not make some of the mistakes that I made the first time around. But so once I had kind of the first version of SMP, what I kind of went back to doing basic science and got interested in kind of some of the most fundamental questions, which is kind of what I've been interested in getting into physics in the first place. But I was particularly interested in the question of complexity. How do things that look complex come to be in nature? And that was a question that sort of one might have thought that all this advanced physics stuff that have been done would have had ways to answer, but it didn't. And so this was around 1981. I got interested in, so how can you answer a question like that? What's the sort of foundational idea necessary to answer a question like that? And I tried to start from various kinds of models, and I tried to sort of do what I'd done in building my first computer language, first computational language, and sort of try and drill down and say, what were the essential primitives that seem to be relevant for the natural world in building, in creating complex kinds of things. And so that led me to start looking at one-dimensional cellular automata, and led me to start just doing computer experiments to see what cellular automata typically do. And I was already very surprised when I started off with the most basic experiments that I did were things like random initial conditions and see how the cellular automaton sort of organizes itself. And so I started analyzing that and started writing a bunch of papers, and people that was rapidly lots of interest in that kind of thing. And so I continued doing that. And in the process of studying cellular automata, I got thinking, so what's the fundamental thing that's going on here? Why is there this kind of complexity that we're seeing? What's really happening? And that led me to a couple of small papers about undecidability and intractability in theoretical physics and so on. That was 1984. I think it was published in 85. And that was kind of the first place where I really enunciated kind of this concept of sort of the universe as a computational system, and thinking about kind of processes in nature as computational processes, although that had been sort of implicit in the things that I've been doing with cellular automata. Maybe if I reread those papers, it's not as implicit as I thought it was, because I certainly did understand that point. What I only understood in 1984 or so was the importance of things like the kind of real way in which sort of foundations of computation engage with the foundations of natural science. So I started understanding that at that time, went on and tried to look at the implications of that specifically for things like cellular automata. By 1986, I kind of was very much sort of trying to develop this field of studying complexity as a phenomenon, what I would have called complexity theory had that not been sort of taken by computational complexity theory. And I tended to use the term complex systems research or complex systems theory and so on. But in any case, that I sort of tried to start the engines on that field, and started a journal, Complex Systems, which is still prospering today, and started a research center for complex systems research and so on. That was 1986. I kind of quickly got frustrated by the speed or lack thereof at which progress was being made. I could see that I could do stuff, but it wasn't clear that other stuff was really happening. And so I kind of decided, plan B, let me try and make the best tools I can and the best environment for myself to actually be able to get productive work done. And that caused me to start building Mathematica on what's now Wolfram Language late in 1986, and also to start building our company, Wolfram Research. And so for about 5 years, that was pretty much what I did, was building the first version of Mathematica, which came out in the middle of 1988, building our company and so on. And that was my activity. By 1990, I guess, I was I had gotten to the point where I guess late '89. You see, one of the things I was just doing recently, I keep good records, and I have good archives, which one day will get organized for the world. But for right now, it's about 4 million pages of material, and organized to the point where I can, with effort, find things in them. But in any case, in the last few weeks, I've been going back and trying to really work through what exactly was the history of how the new kind of science got written, how I started writing it, how it turned into what it finally became. And one of the things that I must say, and it's sort of a lesson about doing history, is, I lived that history. And yet, as I look back, what's now 30 years later, 30 years after the initiation of that project, it's remarkable to what extent one can kind of join the dots and see what was really going on in a way that I don't think I could when I was sort of on the ground making each of those dots, so to speak. So it's been an interesting process going through and looking at that history. I think one of the things that has really been very striking to me, I've been rereading things like emails that I sent in 1991 and so on. And one of the things that's true about most of those emails that involve other people and so on is that every story that was opened in 1991, the end of that story is now pretty much known, including the end of the story of the creation of a new kind of science and so on. So I guess it's been interesting to see that, but I was quite surprised by some of the things I found in kind of the timeline of what led to what and so on, and what was the exact amount of time that things happened, and what was some of the key moments. I've tried to describe that in the piece that I wrote about the making of a new kind of science, and I'll try and tell you something about it here. All right, so what do we know about sort of how all this stuff got initiated? Well, the first thing I was able to find is from November of 1989, and I think I remember creating this. This was the first table of contents, and sort of the idea was it was what I wanted to do was to just kind of make a good exposition of the things that I thought I had figured out about complexity and so on in the 1980s, and I thought that was my kind of step one. And then I was going to go on and figure out the next steps in terms of the research. But first, I just wanted to write a clear exposition of what I had already pretty much, I thought, figured out. And I'd had the experience of writing the Mathematica book, which came out in 1988 when the first version of Mathematica came out. And that was a pretty straightforward thing to write. It was something, and people seem to really like it. It's written in a pretty clear expository style. In some ways, it's become more difficult. The first Mathematica book was like 700 pages long, 600 pages long, and I think was kind of a good armchair read, so to speak, for people who are interested in kind of applying computation to technical fields. Subsequently, as the system got bigger, it got more difficult to make a sort of a manageable book, and now the book would be 300,000 pages long, and is all online and so on. So, in any case, I'd had that experience. That had been a pretty sort of successful experience of writing the original version 1 of the Mathematica book. I had, in 1990, I was writing version 2 of the Mathematica book, which was, again, a fairly straightforward experience. But my idea originally was, let me do sort of the same kind of writing exercise for the things that I had done in studying complexity and so on, and just write a good exposition of those things, and then figure out how to take the next steps. That was idea number 1. So the first working title was Complexity, an Introduction to the Science of Complex Phenomena. And kind of the emphasis here was on things like, I was talking about it was kind of going to start off with, well, what is this complexity phenomenon? Let's show an actual gallery of complex phenomena in different fields. Chapter 2 listed here the goals of a theory of complexity, and then talking about cellular automata, and then various other kinds of things. I guess by section 5 here, I had something about computational irreducibility and its consequences. So I knew that was an important thing. Another section was the nature of randomness, and then talking about thermodynamics and large-scale limits. And then I had a section which had no sub-elements under it, called defining complexity, which at the time was something people kept on saying, define complexity. What does it mean? It's kind of like, if you're a biologist, you define life. That's on page 1. Well, it doesn't really need to be, but it's a kind of a very a certain kind of approach to science says, define these things. And that's I think, it turns out not to be the most important part of the story. And then I had originally had this idea that sort of adaptive systems, people have been kind of selling the concept that adaptive systems were beyond cellular automata. I had studied cellular automata that adapted back in 1986 and so on. I'd studied neural nets back in 1981. But I was still sort of, I somewhat believed the propaganda that, adaptive systems were somehow different and bigger, better, stronger, livelier, etc. In any case, so I think the very beginning of the book, the purpose of this book is to develop a science of complexity. Our goal is to find general principles that allow us to describe and explain the many instances of complexity in the natural and artificial world. So that was kind of part, sort of approach number 1. And that was kind of what in late 1989 was what I sort of thought I was going to do. I think it looks like in December, I had a new title, Algorithms in Nature, an Introduction to Complexity. But by 1990, I was like, we got to finish Mathematica version 2. I would say, by the way, that what initiated me even starting to think about working on science was that in 1989, we had finished Mathematica version 1.2, which was kind of the big clean up the things that were not done properly for version 1.0 when we first launched the product. But in 1990, Mathematica 2.0 was the big thing, and it was a big push to get that new version created. And I have to say, as the years have gone by, it's progressively become easier to do the actual process of getting new versions out. And we'll see, maybe there'll be one of these times there'll be a truly calm release of the product. In any case, in 1990, I don't think I worked that much on the science project. But I think I found one note that I think is from the middle of that year. That's another one of this sort of the beginning of the book kind of thing. Well, so the question was, what should this book be like? And in the late 1980s, one of the things that really come on the scene was popular science books. There have been things like Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. There have been all kinds of other books. That was the Chaos book that unattribute that has a bunch of stuff from me, actually, which I don't think was ever really attributed, but it's a bunch of material that comes from me in that book. But these were sort of popular science books, that was kind of a genre that had developed in the book publishing world, was these books kind of intended for a general audience that were about science. So one question was that the right packaging for whatever it was that I was going to write? And so I wanted to understand the world of popular science books. And I talked to lots of people who'd written them. I talked to the editors who'd worked on them at publishing companies. And I said, what's going on with these popular science books? Because the word in the press was often, oh, millions of copies of Brief History of Time have been sold, very few have been read. That was kind of the sort of one of the public vibes about the whole thing. Internal to the publishing industry, it was like, well, we don't really know why these are selling. We put these books out and they sell, and that's great. And I remember talking to one editor who'd done a number of successful such books. He had probably the most interesting comment, which was he thought these were books that were being bought by people who in another age would have been buying philosophy books. But nowadays, philosophy was way too technical a field. And this was answering, these kinds of science books were addressing and answering the kinds of questions that had previously been the domain of philosophy. Also, a lot of people seem to believe in the publishing industry that actually it was really an internal market, that who was really buying these books? It was other scientists. It was like, if it's a book about physics, it'll be being bought by biologists and so on. So, okay, so I thought, you know, I've been a person who's been running companies for 40 something years now. And so kind of the obvious thing to do if you want to understand something about the market is you just go analyze that market and go do sort of basic things like survey people, who's actually buying these books, those kinds of things. And so I asked sort of people in the publishing industry, you know, have you done that? And they said, oh, no, that's not how things work in publishing. I think part of the attitude is what you publish is whatever the authors write. And it's no good. You can say, well, there's a perfect thing over in this corner of publishing space, but no author will ever write that, so who cares? But in any case, I decided I would actually do some kind of analysis of this. And so produced this survey that the publisher who'd done the Mathematica book and done very well with it was kind of keen to be involved. And they said, great, we'll do this survey. And so this is a survey. Here's the more complete version of it, general science books survey. And kind of the theory, I have to apologize for the 1990-ness of some of the categories of occupations and things like that we have there, and other things. But this was written in 1990 when the world was different. In any case, this survey asks all kinds of questions, probably too many questions. Like, do you give books as gifts to colleagues, friends, spouse, parents, children under 16, your children over 16, other relatives, etc.? Have you been to an author appearance or lecture at a bookstore? I asked. Which of the following are you a member of? Book of the Month Club, the Planetary Society, Sierra Club, all these kinds of things, professional societies. For what purpose do you read books? Recreation, help with career, retool for the future, stay abreast of current affairs, requirement for school or job, or other. And things like, where do you do your reading? At home, at the office, while commuting, while traveling for business, during vacations, at a cafe or other public place. Remember, this is physical books we're talking about here because electronic books weren't a thing yet. And then I come down, I was trying to sort of triangulate what do people actually, these people in bookstores, what do they know about? What are their kind of, so I asked, which of the following scientists and others have you heard of? And some of these people will have very much heard of today. Some of them may have reduced in visibility. And then I asked about various kinds of books. Which books have you done the following? And then I asked, what do you think of the following fields? This is kind of a fun one. From very interesting, fairly interesting, old hat, waste of time, and never heard of it. So, there's artificial intelligence, artificial life, catastrophe theory, chaos theory, complexity theory, cosmology, paleontology, extraterrestrial intelligence, genetic engineering, neural nets, planetary exploration, quantum theory, and unified field theories. So anyway, a lot of fun questions, which of the following have you heard of, black holes and so on. This survey and it's the full form of it is in this post. And the survey ended with questions like, do you use a computer, at your office every day, at your office sometimes, etc., not often? And then, do you use electronic mail or online bulletin boards? Not at all. The internet, CompuServe, Prodigy, internal network within my organization or other services. And the final question, when do you think electronic books will become common? Remember, this is 1990. So one checkbox was here today, within 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and never. So I think we were right at the end. The truth was about 15 years from that time. Well, maybe a little bit more than that, actually. No, from that time, it was more like 20 years. So in any case, that was kind of a kind of an interesting thing to look at. Well, the problem was, it had this lovely survey, and it was like, we're going to find something out about how the popular science book market works. Only problem was, I kept on poking this publisher, have you done these surveys? You've got to go make deals with bookstore people and, accost people in bookstores and get surveys done, clipboards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, it was like, oh my gosh, we don't know how to do this. Okay, fine. Really, you don't know how to go to a bookstore. And I think I considered just doing it ourselves. And by that time, I just decided, forget it. This isn't worth doing. So far as I know, this survey was never done. Although for all I know, there's somewhere, and it didn't make it to my archives, there's some finished surveys that were done. But I also kind of understood more about the kind of popular science books world, and every book that came out, it had a hook. And the hook was some kind of sensationalistic thing about, did you know dinosaurs were really, had a civilization, and it all disappeared before our time type thing, or whatever else. And I sort of got very turned off by the sort of the apparent need for sort of the sensationalistic hook in these books. So I cooled on the idea of this being sort of a quotes popular science book. Anyway, so January 1991, we finished version Mathematica 2.0. Then I did a 35-city tour of the US and Europe, talking about kind of the new paradigm for technical computing that we were creating at that time. I think the term technical computing was invented by me for that tour. It was subsequently taken by other people for other purposes, but that was when it was invented. I think that in one of those bad ideas, we had announced version 2 of Mathematica in January of 1991, but we weren't actually able to ship it until later in the year. And so I think it was July, we finally delivered the production floppy disks to the disk duplicator. That's what you had to do in those days, because software was still sold through software stores in cardboard boxes with floppy disks and so on for workstation type computers. It was with tapes and such like. So in any case, July 1991, finally sort of finished with Mathematica 2.0, time to see what to do next. I had kind of a big roadmap of what the company should do and what we should do in terms of product development, and that roadmap was way larger than we could possibly achieve in a short period of time. In fact, as I was working on this post, I found the version 2.3 roadmap in detail, and that was from I think February of 1993. It's interesting to look at that. I had looked previously at my 1991 to-do lists, and I can say that in the last 5 years or so, we've finally finished the 1991 to-do list. But back in 1991, my calculation was I could either be there kind of bugging people, finish the to-do list now, or I could kind of throttle back on my kind of daily involvement in, here's the roadmap, this is what we should be doing, let's do it, and do what I had originally planned to do, which was to take the tools that I had been building and to use them to further these questions, these intellectual questions about basic science. And so that's what I did. So my plan was, the company is based in Illinois, and my plan was I'm going to become a remote CEO. This was in 1991, so I was a bit ahead of the times. And at that time, I moved to hills near California, near San Francisco in California. So, so it was not quite as easy to be a remote CEO back in those days as it has been in more recent years. And in those days, it was kind of like, mail gets collected every 15 minutes by the computer. Automatically, that was already an innovation. And I had sort of a computer-connected fax machine that would sort of automatically receive things and put them in mail and things like that. But I also wanted to I was kind of getting ready to actually figure out how to do the science and sort of build the tools to do that. And so I had this system that I built in the 1980s, which had a text-based interface for studying cellular automata and so on. It actually worked rather well. I just found a picture of the setup of that program in 1983. This is the first office that I had at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton when I went there in 1983, together with complete with, well, yes, there are old phones there. That's a modem in case people don't recognize it. And that there is a textile cone shell. Already the mascot organism of this project was present. So back in 1991, I could go beyond kind of the text interface and so on. Instead, what I wanted to do was to just build Wolfram language Mathematica functions for what I wanted, and this was sort of a staged version of the things that I built at that time for doing this whole symbolic representation of cellular automata, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is sort of a typical working notebook of the time. And in fact, at that time, I should say that at that time, the primary machine that I ended up using was a Next computer that had come out. Mathematica was bundled on the Next computer starting in when Next came out in late 1988. In a footnote to history that people might know, there was a batch of Next computers that was bought by the theory group at CERN because they thought it was a great deal to buy those machines and get the Mathematica for free. And those machines ended up having as their sysadmin Tim Berners-Lee, who developed the original web on those machines. So that was a sort of a side benefit, I suppose, of the bundling of Mathematica on Next computers. But this was a rather curious picture that captured of the sort of remote CEO hiding out with an Next computer behind. I think that was 1991. I don't have a lot of pictures of myself, which is probably a good thing. That was in 1993. I was kind of a remote CEO for a few weeks. That was in some hotel room somewhere, and that's what the Next computer looked like. That was its printer and such like. So that was kind of the basic setup for doing this work. It's kind of fun that you can take a piece of code and a notebook. Even back in those days, .nb files were called .ma for Mathematica files. A .ma file, you have to run it through a converter to .nb format, but then it just runs and the code just runs, which is really cool. And something certainly very important for my efforts in doing science over a long period of time, and now for our kind of open science initiatives. Well, so 1991. I'm kind of become a remote CEO. I'm kind of starting to work on things for the book, and one of the things that was sort of a big question was, so I'd seen all these phenomena to do with simple rules, complicated behavior. I'd seen that happen in cellular automata. Question was, how general was that behavior? And and what I didn't remember until I looked back at this a few weeks ago is kind of how suddenly I realized that this was a much more general phenomenon. So this is my directories from that time, and this is September of 1991, and there's a whole series of these mobile automata. By the next day, we've got Turing machines, and we've got tag systems, and we've got these generalized mobile automata, and so on. And so what I think happened, so far as I can tell, is that at that time in September of 1991, I just started writing code for all these other kinds of systems, and I started seeing whether, in fact, those systems, like cellular automata, could show complex behavior. Those are some notebooks from the time. It's kind of amazing that, for example, that is a post-tag system whose behavior I worked out, where I restudied this again early last year, and I still have that same plot was still one that I generated early last year. These are things that are very kind of, they're like sort of polyhedra from antiquity. These are things that sort of, they last for all time. These are some, that looks like it was a search for some Turing machines, and so on. This is just a few printouts from back in those times. It was pretty common for me to run sort of long-running jobs for sometimes weeks on, well, by that point, a network of a few hundred computers. And this was something that pretty similar to what one might do today. This was sending me email when it was doing a search, and it had found, okay, F14 passed. I suppose that was, it went through, I guess I wasn't using subject lines in those days, so I don't even know what this is. But this is some kind of, well, I guess P probably means periodic. I'm not sure, but this is searching for some kind of system, and it managed to find one that it thought was worth looking further at. Well, so the big thing, September 1991, give or take, the big sort of discovery was this phenomenon of simple rules, complex behavior was not restricted to cellular automata, was something much more general. I was working pretty hard on that. There were a number, this was a sort of a distraction. This was a big fire in the Oakland Hills that almost burnt down our house, but didn't quite. So that was only a few day distraction, but fortunately missed. In any case, that was kind of that time. In fall of 1991 was kind of when I really realized that the phenomena I'd seen to do with complexity and so on in cellular automata were not restricted to cellular automata. I kind of suspected that. I kind of implicitly knew that back in the mid-1980s, but I never really went and explicitly studied it. And I should have done, but I didn't. It took me an extra, probably 6 or 7 years to get around to actually doing those obvious experiments and studying that. Once I'd studied that and I could see that this phenomenon was quite ubiquitous to all these different kinds of systems, well, then that kind of opened the door to the principle of computational equivalence. And I kind of was remembering, I was trying to triangulate on exactly when I figured that out, but it was sometime in basically probably spring of 1992. And I remember the moment when I figured that out, and it was kind of like, this is kind of obvious. And, the name for the thing arose at the same time that I figured out the thing. And that was I think, in the spring of 1992. Unfortunately, archives are not perfect. I can't quite figure out exactly when that was. Okay, so I was working out these various things, but also my kind of framing for this project was I was going to write a book. And so first question about a book is, I'm going to write this book. And for me, I find it very helpful when I'm writing things, unless it's pure text, I really need to be able to visualize what is this thing going to look like when it has been created. So I need to know kind of what's the page layout going to look like. And I knew there would be lots of pictures here because even from papers I'd written back in the 1980s, they were routinely, full of all kinds of pictures. These were pictures that I produced on a laser printer, and then usually with Scotch tape and things, was attaching to pages and then sending in as kind of camera-ready copy to journals. So that was, I knew it was going to have pictures. Question is kind of what would the book be like? And, this was the original Mathematica book, and it had a definite design, and it had this kind of these sort of 2-column dialogues and these boxes. I remember the first version of these boxes didn't have gray backgrounds. I think it was Steve Jobs actually told me you really should emphasize them by having some background color there, which he was right about. But in any case, the sort of this idea of this kind of which actually we haven't done so much in recent times, but it worked rather well, of this kind of 2-column the sort of the computational dialogue and the commentary there. But anyway, so this book, the way this was produced, it was produced by an extension of Tech. that was all interwoven with Wolfram language code. It's a big build system that built it. But my original source for this book was basically tech-like code. And that was what I was authoring it in. And the layout was such that it would just sort of naturally make itself work given that code. It was less clear that that would work when you had pictures that were more of these kind of more kind of sort of big blocks of pictures and such like. So I started getting sort of potential layouts. This must have been, this was November of 1991, started getting sort of potential layouts. And I had a little bit of text that I'd written just in plain text files. We started looking at what could the layout look like. And we were like, well, you know, there's text and there's sort of special boxes and notes and things, a little bit like a textbook, typical kind of textbook setup. And then we were like, okay, they've got to be diagrams and things as well. What would these diagrams be like? And so the first idea was, let's do them kind of old-fashioned Scientific American style. Let's do them kind of really sort of a diagram with art, so to speak. And so we tried making some of these. And actually, I found these, I sort of, you know, drew sketches for these, and someone else actually created them. They were very difficult to specify. I think cellular automata are a particularly difficult case because of the way that their updates kind of overlap, and that's a little hard to draw pictorially like this. But in any case, so it's probably just as well that we started with cellular automata, which were a hard case. But the problem with these pictures was when you started really looking at them, it's like they get very confusing. They look very cool when you first see them. They're very attractive, but when you start trying to understand what's really going on, what do all those lines mean? You know, is that part of the system itself, or is that just an explanatory line? You know, how do these things come together? And I was very big on the idea of trying to have as crisp as possible an explanation of things. And I wanted that to kind of carry through to the pictorial side of things. And I wanted the pictures to carry a bunch of the explanation. And so I got into this idea of, well, let's try and do something different. Let's try and make the pictures be sort of as direct as possible. Don't have and have them kind of explain themselves in a completely direct way. So that's how I ended up with a lot of the pictures as they were in the book, where kind of the idea was that by just looking at the picture, you don't even have to read the words. By just looking at the picture, you can kind of see how things kind of fit together. You can see, oh, that looks like this. It's kind of a pattern matching exercise. You can kind of see how this thing is built. And there's nothing here beyond what needs to be there for the system. There are no, you know, construction lines. There's no sort of arrows pointing from here to there. It's a very direct representation. And also one of the principles in the book was you should be able to get an idea of what's in the book by just looking at pictures and reading captions without reading any of the main text. So that was sort of an objective. Now, as the book progressed, I mean, one of the things that was very important was these were algorithmically generated diagrams, not something people had really thought about, I think, very much before. But this was something where deeply interwoven with kind of Wolfram language, with the actual computation of things, was the production of diagrams, and often quite elaborate ones. By the end of working on the book, I think things went a little bit overboard, and this was probably one of the most complicated diagrams. This is showing, this sort of giving evidence that satisfiability is equivalent to non-deterministic Turing machines. This is probably a bit of an extreme overkill type self-explanatory diagram, but that was kind of a thing that this kind of whole idea of sort of the self-explanatory diagram was kind of the was the thing. So kind of the original idea also was that the book would be the original idea was to have something very structured where there was text and there were like historical notes set off, there were implementation notes, there were technical notes and so on, all kind of set off in the structure of the page, as one sometimes finds in things like textbooks. Didn't take too long to realize that was way too complicated, and one should just collect all the notes at the back of the book. Now, had I really known that the book would be most commonly read in an online format, I would have been even less worried about that, because it's just a link away, so to speak. But you know, they're very, very basic questions about book design that had to be answered to be able to actually start laying out pages, like what shape was the book going to be? You know, we'll make it squarish. The Mathematica book had been kind of squarish. This book, to really fit really sort of nice plush images. One needed a fairly wide format for the book. But that created all kinds of issues, like you can't have the text be too wide or it becomes very hard to read. Newsprint and newspaper, it's, you have small columns, it's easy to read. By the time the text gets wide, really wide, it's too hard to read. So you have to keep the text fairly narrow, but then you have pictures sticking out and that can look really ugly. And so that kind of made it clear that one would need to have sort of a quite interactive process of laying out the book. So the next kind of big issue was, okay, we're going to put all these images in the book. How do we make these images and how does that whole workflow work? So back in the 1980s, I think I first got a laser printer in 1984. I had first seen a laser printer actually at Xerox PARC in the late 1970s, but I first had one myself in, I think, 1984. And it was able to do a pretty good job of printing your average cellular automaton. In fact, I first really understood Rule 30 as a result of sort of testing the laser printer by saying, let me really print a high resolution version of this, of what the cellular automaton does. And then one sort of sees Rule 30. Those did okay. I was interested in sort of higher resolution pictures. Good example was in 1985, I could generate much larger cellular automata, for example, using the connection machine computer, a massively parallel computer made by a company called Thinking Machines Corporation in Boston that I've been a consultant for. It was possible to make these rather large cellular automaton evolutions. And how do you print it out? Well, conveniently, because they were a hardware company, they had these wide format printers that were used for printing out things like circuit boards and microprocessor designs and so on. And so that was a good sort of way to print the thing out. And so you lay the thing out on the floor and you could kind of analyze Rule 30 and so on. And I think I have the Rule 30 printout somewhere, and I was looking for it and I can't find it. It was printed, I think, on a Versatech printer, if I remember correctly. I don't know what happened to that one, but I have some other ones that I printed out. Like this is this was what happened to a Rule 110 printout that was laminated when my children were young. This was a quite favored, kind of very curious kind of hiding place. Obviously, not very large children still fit in that. When it came to printing something like this really high resolution picture, this was a picture, I think 1985, printed in a journal from a high resolution Rule 30 pattern. And it looks kind of crummy and it's got all kinds of weird artifacts in it. And it's not a very crisp printout. And that was sort of an issue for the time. So let's see. So what was going to happen by the beginning of the 1990s? What was the right way to get sort of high resolution images rendered? Turns out, very important decision that we made at the very beginning in 1987, in the beginning of developing Mathematica, was we're going to use PostScript to represent graphics. So back, many computers had represented graphics using bitmaps, just using pixel arrays in black and white or in color with some color depth of some number of bits of color and so on. PostScript had been developed as a way, particularly to render fonts, to render characters in text, where the character will be represented by splines typically, or Bezier curves, cubic curves, and so on. That would be kind of the way that you draw that letter M or something like that in a particular font will be with those curves. And that had the big advantage that when you made a very big letter M, it still looked perfect because it was specified using these curves and they could be rendered in any resolution you want. So that had been a technology developed, and that was the original Apple LaserWriter printer, was sort of the first big place where PostScript was used. And that was kind of what had launched desktop publishing and things like this. But PostScript was in general a page description language, and it was a thing that allowed you to specify graphics primitives. And so among other things, you could also use it to specify sort of graphics that weren't for text, that were pictures of mathematical curves or whatever else. And so that's what we decided to do for Mathematica, was to use PostScript as the transport mechanism for for graphics. And that had the big advantage that at that time, more and more printers were starting to support PostScript. They weren't just bitmaps, they were starting to support PostScript. And so we could leverage that capability to be able to have arbitrary resolution graphics printed on printers. I mean, it was, so there were a lot of tricky things there. I mean, when you did 3D graphics, we had to do sort of resolution independent hidden surface elimination. That was a whole adventure. And sometimes we have to be careful because you would crash the printer. People at that time were very surprised by the concept that you could crash a printer. But of course, people know by now, and printers have computers in them. In fact, the LaserWriter was a more powerful computer and had it inside it than the Mac that drove it back in the early days of that. So in any case, we were using PostScript. That meant that whatever graphics we were generating were of arbitrarily high resolution. And that was important because on a screen, you would have like 72 dots per inch on a typical screen. On a laser printer, you might have 300 dots per inch. But when you printed on a printing press, you could routinely get 2,400 dots per inch. So if your goal was to make a book, you could routinely get much higher resolution than you could achieve in any of these kind of on your computer type things. So, there were all kinds of issues. I mean, one of the issues was you got a picture of Rule 30. Okay, great. Now let's have a picture of Rule 30 that shows the individual cells. How do we do that? Well, you can't have you could say, well, I'm just going to use black lines, but if you use black lines, you can't see black lines between black cells. And so you have to pick the gray level and so on. And we built a system where I had kind of a good pipeline where there was sort of a set of definitions that percolated through all these different kinds of algorithmic diagrams. And that was important because a number of times we had to change kind of the standards for the gray level or the thickness of the lines and so on. And as I'll talk about, I mean, a lot of that ended up being a story of things about details of printing technology, exactly what were the possible line thicknesses that you could use and so on. Okay, so one of the things that was an issue was, were we going to print the book in color or black and white? That was a very fundamental decision. It was clearly going to be much cheaper to print it in black and white than to print it in color. At the time, I mean, things have changed, I think, a bit, and perhaps high resolution black and white printing is not such a common thing, but it was clearly going to be more difficult to print it in color than to print it in black and white. And the question was color actually important? And I'd had the experience in the 1980s of making lots of cellular automata with color, and I would have green cells and red cells and blue cells and so on. And one of the things that had happened was that it was super confusing often, because I would think, oh, this is a 3-color cellular automaton, but wait a minute, when I look at the picture, it seems to have 5 different colors in it. How can that be? And the answer was that it's a matter of color perception and a matter of how one color, when embedded in an environment of other colors, what that color actually looks like. And so I did a bunch of experiments trying to figure out how would I do color correction so that I would make it sort of more red than another red, so that even when it was on a blue background or something, it would still look red. And I decided that was probably an unstable problem and couldn't be solved. So in the end, that was one of the reasons why, even if we could do color, even if that was an economically viable and a technically viable thing to do, it wasn't clear it was actually desirable. And black and white looked really kind of really communicated things in a very crisp way. In some cases in the NKS book, I have to say I somewhat missed not having color, and maybe we should make a colorized version of some parts of it. But certainly things like Rule 30, they do just fine in black and white. And in keeping with the fact that the book really tried to be as direct as possible, I even have a note at the back about why it didn't use color and so on. Okay, well, so I'm going to write this book, and I realized that because it had lots of pictures, it would have to be laid out in detail, sort of page by page. And so how are we going to do that? There were sort of basic desktop publishing tools that existed at the time. They really weren't adequate. There was a new program called FrameMaker, which was kind of interpolated between the very high-end typesetting systems that were used by publishing companies that were really pretty non-end user to operate with, and the desktop publishing programs that didn't really have the full sort of book creation tools. FrameMaker was somewhere in the middle of those, and that's what I started using. And conveniently, It was on the next. In fact, I think we first found out about it. I think I might have first found out about it at the next product announcement in 1989 when I ran into its CEO. But in any case, it was that's what I started using. Had I started the book later in the development of Wolfram language and so on, I would have just used notebooks. We had notebooks from back in 1987, and notebooks were what I used all the time to do my actual research, but we didn't have the capabilities to do sort of book layouty kinds of things in notebooks at that time. And I mean, nowadays we print books from notebooks, but that was not really a realistic thing at the time. As it turned out, later on, we had to suck everything out of FrameMaker, process it in Wolfram language, and put it back in FrameMaker. That was sort of a late stage issue with the book. I might talk about that in a bit. But in any case, FrameMaker did a nice job handling all these PostScript graphics. It turned out the Next had another important feature, which was that it was screen natively using PostScript. So when you saw something on the screen, any window, it was rendered using PostScript. So that meant that the PostScript that we were generating within Mathematica was just directly renderable on the screen, and it could be directly imported by reference into FrameMaker, and it was really a pretty good pipeline. So that was my typical daily working environment. And I have to say, I tried very hard to really make things actually work in detail. And so, for example, one thing I wanted to avoid was I hated these things where it says, see figure 17. If you look at the NKS book, you will find it never has to name a figure. It never does that. It always says, see the picture on the facing page, see the picture on the next page. It's always just having those kind of local kinds of things, or maybe sometimes see the picture on page such and such, but it isn't using kind of the device of saying the figures are floating freely, that's because that's kind of a device to make books that have big blocks of pictures sort of float within text. But we didn't do that. Instead, I kind of personally laid out every page so that didn't have to happen. I also was kind of obsessive. I decided, given that I'm laying out every page, I'm going to avoid things like hyphenation. So I was kind of sometimes rewording things to avoid hyphenation, or sometimes redoing the kerning, letter spacing, and so on to avoid hyphenation. That's perhaps a bit obsessive. And some of the more amusing things that happened were that there were pages where I kind of know that I studied a whole new class of systems just because I wanted to make the page fit. I didn't want there to be a big gap on the end of the page. So I'm like, I need something to fill this page. Let me go and study some other system here. So that's sort of a science driven by page layout, which is a bit odd. But often there was sort of lots of puzzles about how you would fit together pages and so on. And how to get these things to work out so that there weren't big gaps and so on in the pages, and that was a sort of a big thing to achieve. So so this was by spring of 1992. I'd already written quite a lot of stuff. There are a lot of pages here which you could recognize in the final NKS book. And there was a lot about cellular automata. The organization is a bit different. There's a lot I can see there about substitution systems. There's mobile automata. I think there's some neighbor-dependent substitution systems I recognize there. Lots of stuff. Turing machines were not yet a main text item because I kind of thought they were not as clean as mobile automata. I've subsequently gotten more respect for Turing machines. This was the table of contents at that time, still very much a complexity-driven story, and similar to what I had had several years earlier. So I think that was Turing machines. They were originally notes at the back of the book, and that was a Turing machine in a note. Is that? No, that isn't yet my friend, the 2-3 Turing machine. That turns out to be the simplest universal Turing machine. That's a slightly more complicated one. But that was a Turing machine that I had found where even from a blank tape and a simple rule, it produces complicated behavior. And I think this is from 92. This is the first place where the principle of computational equivalence appears, though not with a lot of text. At that time, I was still very much focused on, let me show, show, don't tell about complexity, and I had all kinds of pictures of complex systems and things, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Another thing from 1992, this was from early 1992, looks like May of 1992, was multi-way systems. That was the first draft of the first section about multi-way systems, which have become a very big thing in the physics project and the whole modern multi-computational paradigm. Originally, I was calling them here multi-way substitution systems, which might have been a better name for the specific multi-way systems I was talking about there. But as you can see, that word didn't make it with a proofreading mark of mine on it. Okay, the table of contents. By when was this? This must have been in early 1993. So this was starting to look a lot more similar to the final table of contents, but still breaking out satisfying constraints as opposed to having a rule which evolves one step to the next. This idea of constraints I thought of as a different kind of thing. And it was eventually covered at the end of chapter 5, but at that point I still was thinking it was a fundamentally different kind of thing. I hadn't really started studying it yet. Talking about processes of perception, I already knew that was an issue. I had known that was an issue from studying kind of the phenomenon of randomness back in the mid-1980s. Then there's the principle of computational equivalence, and fundamental implications were chapter 14 at that time. At that time, I kind of had in mind that I would have sort of notes for different kinds of folk at the back of the book. I think this would have been a lot of work, and I'm not sure that I could necessarily have distinguished exactly what should be written for the computer scientist versus the versus the applied mathematician and so on. But that was not a thing that I pursued in the end. So 1993 also, the very beginning of the section about fundamental physics. I'd been thinking about sort of network-based systems, and I have a bunch of notes actually from 1993 about that I just found. But this was sort of the beginning of the stub of what was then chapter 10, would later become chapter 9 about fundamental physics. I also had sort of chapter summaries that I was intending to put at the beginning of the book, which included sort of a chapter summary. The high point is probably my still speculative attempt to reformulate the foundations of physics in computational terms, including new models for space-time and quantum mechanics. So that was kind of the first shot across the bow or something of the physics project back in 1993. So at some point, so February 1994, I was already getting, that was the kind of a mock-up version of the book. That was the printout. That was the thickness relative to the final thickness. There's where it was. That was what that looked like. And there were already starting to be at that time notes, but started looking very much like the final notes of the book. In fact, one could even recognize some of these notes made it into the final book. By September 1994, the book was 658 pages long. I can tell you that the final book ended up being 1,280 pages long. But by September 1994, it was already 658 pages, and the table of contents that I had by that time was pretty much what it ended up being. In fact, I think few of these chapter names changed, but otherwise it was the same, except it dropped the epilogue and it dropped the bibliography. And those had been things at that time. So let's see. Right. I think yeah, this was an early section. Oops, not what I wanted there. This was an early section about the story of my work on complexity, which included a sort of that image of a notebook running on an X computer. And the caption here talked about the fact that in the course of the project, I generated 3 gigabytes of notebooks, a number which considerably increased by the end of the actual project. Caption also said, the card at the back of this book gives information about obtaining some of the programs used. So that was in September of 1994. And I will say that our first corporate website went live on October 7th, 1994. So that was, I was still in the cards at the back of the book. We'll send you a floppy disk. Although within a month, we were live on the web, so to speak. Okay, so that was sort of setting the form of the book. So at the time, as I was thinking about sort of complexity as a theme, I was still thinking there's got to be pictures of complexity. You know, it's like show complexity and so on. So one of the activities, this particularly 1991, 1992, was taking photographs, and so these were taken. I didn't personally take a lot of these photographs. I usually was setting the stuff up, and somebody else was taking the photographs. I should say the person who was the book designer for the book, who worked on it from the very beginning, got to see the whole project through, and 30 years later is still at our company, actually in a much more senior role. So he's had a chance, like me, to see this whole sort of arc take place. But he took a lot of these pictures, so you know, this was on film, right? This is a contact sheet from film. You know, showing the fact that there were different exposures and things, and this was, you know, the bolt was to show simplicity as well as complexity of things. So there were many pictures of many kinds of things. So sometimes, you know, you kind of just go out in the backyard, you find the specimens. Sometimes you just look up in the sky to find the specimens. Sometimes it's like things that are sitting on one's desk. That trilobite I've had for a long time. It's kind of like didn't make it into the book. It waited 400 million years, but still didn't make it into the book. The paperclip also didn't make it into the book. This was kind of this was out in the field, you know, sort of taking photographs of curious-looking plants with an attempt to make them kind of a mobile studio there. These were some of the adventures of that. You know, my whole view of going to, I went to lots of botanical gardens, museums, zoos, things like this. This was a zoo. I have to say my whole view of zoos really changed working on the book, because I was interested in pigmentation patterns of animals. And before that, I'd been mostly, you know, go to a zoo, be amused to think that that animal looks like a person I know type thing. But after that, after working on pigmentation patterns, it's like I'm looking at, you know, the legs of the animal, the head of the animal, the tail of the animal. How does its pigmentation pattern work in those different places? What's the relative growth, the sort of differential geometry of the animal? Anyway, this was a giraffe that was super frustrating, because I was there for like 15 minutes waiting for the thing to turn around, because I was trying to take pictures of both sides of the giraffe to figure out whether its reticulated pattern was the same on both sides or not. Answer: it's not. These were some attempted sort of examples of simple sort of systems with simple behavior. This was when I just noticed that as I was looking at these pictures, that there's me doing the experiment, so to speak, trying to blow bubbles. Not a very successful picture of the bubbles. So lots of kinds of things that happened in this. This was grocery store type material. I'm kind of guessing that I ate the cookie. Then I was realizing, just looking through all these pictures, there are lots of pictures. This was a rock, paper, scissors, not intended as rock, paper, scissors. They were all for different purposes. I was trying to show complexity of crumpling patterns, simplicity of structures, complexity of rocks, and so on. We tried to do some sort of physics experiments. This was a billiard balls experiment, which was kind of a flop, because you can't really tell that isn't just a simulation. And not interestingly, billiard balls. Some things a little bit more, much harder to simulate. Splashes. There was a big splash that we made, spilled milk, so to speak. Another thing I was very keen on was to study sort of repeatability of complex flows and fluids. And so this is dropping, I did this so many times, dropping food dye into a big glass container that I bought at some surplus store, and taking pictures of what happened and trying to see to what extent the detailed patterns of flow here are reproducible, are repeatable. Same kind of thing we had a setup with smoke, looking at how sort of laminar smooth flow turns into turbulent flow there. This was sometimes, some of these experiments were kind of like home experiments like this one. Some of them were not so home experiments. This was a lab at University of Illinois that is a fluids lab. I think it had been built in the 1930s, actually, a very old lab that this was, I happened to notice in the picture that I happened to be in the picture. That's a hydraulic jump. And that same lab, lots of interesting pictures of things which I had kind of simulated many times and had kind of seen anecdotally, but it was nice to see in detail kind of what really the vortex street looks like behind an obstacle and things like this. Many other adventures. I was very curious about fracture surfaces and whether you would get repeatable randomness in fracture. And so this was silicon came from a friend of mine, and I just exchanged mail with her, and we can't figure out whether this is an electron microscope picture taken her an electron microscope or a visible light picture that I might have taken. But in any case, this was a kind of a close-up of the fracture surface of that silicon, showing all these crack formations and so on. I never ended up using these pictures in the book, although I certainly used the knowledge of what I had seen in these pictures to try and say things about sort of formulating a theory of fracture. Right around that time, I ended up getting a fracture of my own. I broke my ankle. And that's I was going to, if we had included fracture pictures in the book, I was going to include that nastily broken fibula there, as an example of fracture. But we didn't end up including those things in the book. This was another piece of that, of the story of the pictures in the book. This was, as I needed for the section on phytotaxis, I needed pictures of cabbage and broccoli. And there was a long-running story about the fact that the cabbage got from the grocery store was eaten by the photographer and happened to be particularly tasty. Well, then there was the whole story of leaves. I was in the book. I have this whole array of pictures of leaves, and that was kind of an adventure to get, because some of those leaves I had taken pictures of in just backyard, botanical gardens, things like this. But I hadn't, I thought I was about to finish the book. This must have been, I think, early 1994. I was about to finish the book, but it was winter time, and I was by that point living in Chicago, the Chicago area, and it was winter time, and there weren't any leaves. And so it's like, how am I going to get leaves? It turned out an employee of ours at the time lived in Australia, and I said, do you have any leaves nearby? I said, well, actually, I'm just down the street from the Melbourne Botanical Gardens, and went and collected lots of leaf samples. So I've still been waiting from the day when some plant biologist tells me, that's a very weird collection of leaves. Some are from California, some are from Illinois, and some are from Australia. And I'd been hoping for many years to do kind of a global leaf project, just finding what are the outlines of leaves from all over the world. But I had kind of had this plan of doing that with a sort of cool little thing with for school kids and so on. But we never managed to find quite the right person to do that project. But the Global Leaf Project is still a thing out there that could be very interestingly done, particularly with modern machine learning and so on, to really map out the space of leaf shapes throughout the world. I will say that another thing along those lines that was also a photograph story was mollusk shells. And there, at some point, I was trying to fill out this array of mollusk shell patterns. I ended up visiting the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and the curator of mollusks was very helpful there. We spent an afternoon kind of trying to fill out this array of all these different mollusk shell shapes. And it was very charming to be told for every mollusk brought out, the story of that mollusk. The mollusk is that shape because, so to speak, which kind of becomes an interesting type of story when you see that all the possible shapes are filled out. Well, I ended up, in fact, I collected a lot of shells. I had been collecting shells since I was a kid, actually. In fact, I even had some, I didn't have textile cones, which have sort of become the favorite thing, but I had some other cone shells. But this is, those were the shells that were on that picture. They're sitting in a drawer in my office still, along with many, many other shells, but those are the ones that were pictured in that picture I just showed. And there were, I have very rarely, I'm sorry to say, actually collected these shells in the wild. They're mostly collected at shops. But sometimes there are adventures even there. Like this is my favorite. It's a false melon volute shell. It's my favorite kind of computational shell, so to speak, which was found in sort of in the back of some small shell shop in Florida. As quite coincidental, they didn't think it was a particularly significant shell because it was like it had a very incomplete pattern. But I was like, that is the best possible thing. It's a really, really good thing. So let's see, the whole sort of story of these pictures. I kind of, when I went away from the idea of sort of, well, I had first of all the idea I'm going to show lots of photographs of complexity. Then I was like, well, let me get drawings of complexity instead. And I was thinking, let's use image processing kinds of techniques. This was long before Wolfram language had image processing capability. Actually, not so long now that I think about it. It will be only a few years before we had serious image processing capabilities. But kind of the idea was to image process photographs to get something that was more like I don't know what, this is kind of going for the Wall Street Journal style stippling pattern photographs. We didn't use that in the end. So we collected a big array of photographs, all sorts of different pictures, some of which got used, many did not. Those are pollen grains. Those are some geology pictures. I had fun actually making that bismuth crystal my very self it's very easy to make bismuth, crystallized bismuth. It melts at a very low temperature. And then, so gradually assembling the pictures for the book. I think most of the pictures on this page did make it eventually into chapter 8, with the exception of that phylotactically themed pangolin, who I don't think made it. During the time I was working on the book, I was pretty hermetic. I didn't really do very many trips anywhere. I did one time. I happened to be in England, and I was at the British Museum and was looking at lots of artifacts. And had a chance to look at a few other museums as well. Always on the search for sort of the origin of patterns made from rules, and trying to understand how the phenomena that I was studying in New Kind of Science, what origins they might have had potentially in the very distant past. This is one that was it's a Celtic pattern. It's kind of a little bit mysterious how this pattern was made. It's kind of I find it ironic that the sort of the Celtic names of mathematicians who've worked on things that lead to patterns awfully like this. It's kind of interesting to see that commonality. But in any case, that's was another sort of things made from rules type pattern. This was one that it was kind of a challenge finding this was mostly done before the web, but even when the web started to exist, it was not easy to find it's not a search you can do, so to speak, interesting patterns made from rules type thing. Probably now there are such searches you can do, but certainly not in the 1990s. And so I went through lots of art history books, trying to find, are there pictures in here that are complicated patterns made from rules? And it's sort of interesting that one day I find this picture, and it's like, or a picture of something like this, and it's like, wow. And the book is mostly talking about the other things that were done by the Cosmati, the family of mosaic layers who made this picture. And it's like, well, I'm actually interested in this purely abstract piece. And so conveniently, an employee of ours happened to be visiting Italy, and so found this somewhat obscure church, which I actually visited many years later, eventually, and took this picture, complete with their feet, of this mosaic. So in any case, that was kind of the story of getting some of the pictures for the book. A big part of the story of the whole thing was kind of what was the framing of the whole book. And that sort of affected the kind of the whole emphasis of things. What should the book be called? And so this was, when was this? This was 1991, I think. That was an early idea. And then the first cover design, that was the first cover design. And this cover design had sort of a funny story because I had kind of been like, let me try and be scientific about the cover design. One thing I know about human visual perception is that people look at eyes. We have, these center surround cells in our primary visual cortex, which kind of, helps emphasize this, black in the middle, white on the outside type things. And so I was like, let's do a little bit of a visual hack. Let's make a cover that has an eye on it. Not a very good idea, but this was an attempt to execute that idea, the eyed cover, so to speak. That was the very first cover for the book, with its first title. So then I didn't really like that title very much. I started doing surveys about and as usual, the survey produced no useful results because different people like different things. We were even making at that time, we were starting to think about sort of detailed covers with quotes on the back, and this was still in the sort of popular science mode of things. It's kind of interesting. The first sentence says, this book, called The Science of Complexity, is about a new kind of science that ... So that terminology was very much there, even the first chapter, there was a section called "The Need for a New Kind of Science." So, in any case, the problem was when I didn't get out very much, but I did occasionally talk to people, and they would say, "What are you doing?" And I've said, "I'm working on this book. What's it called?" It's called A Science of Complexity or some such other thing. And the typical response to that would be people saying, "Oh, that sounds really complicated." End of conversation. So this had happened one too many times. And I was like, this title is a bad title. I need a better title. What should I use? And I realized, if I was going to, and this is sort of a test I use for making up names of orphan language functions as well, say in a sentence, what is this thing? Okay, you'd say, say it, you can say it in a longer version, just say it in a sentence. What is this thing? And so that's how this is. I think I was wandering around somewhere and I was like, okay, I'm thinking about that. Look, the obvious thing is a new kind of science. And so this was sort of written on the back of my then business card. That was the first kind of, that's really got to be the title. So, but then I kind of thought, well, that's a little bit of a wimp out. It's kind of a new kind of science, but what's the science called? Doesn't it have a name? What about, all these other sciences like physics and things like that, they have names. So I then started thinking about what possible name could I use. There's roots like comp for computation, prog for program, auto for automata, a big sort of Greek Latin dictionary extravaganza, those kinds of things. The one piece of, I just found this a few days ago. This was a possible name that I tried out. Programmistics, thankfully, didn't end up sticking. There was algonomics and grammistry after chemistry and regulistics and so on. Strangely, ruleology was not on this list. I don't know why. I mean, that's a very recent name that I think is a good name for sort of the core study of simple programs. So anyway, so that was about the title of the book. Well, in addition to the title, one has to worry about the cover. So I showed you that eye-based cover, but by 1990, this must have been 1992, we were already starting to think about, well, okay, what would the cover look like? Well, it mattered what the title was, but here were a few kind of attempts at covers from the book. So we tried a few different colors, and then eventually this was sort of settled on as kind of a potential cover for the book. So it's got our mascot textile code, our Rule 30, and there's the title and so on. But I kind of felt that this was a bit, then this cover was sort of a working cover for a couple of years, during which time the title changed, and conveniently, the title still fitted. And I have this copy, my copy from that time, literally has the new title pasted on top of it, and one of those palimpsest kind of schemes, pasted on top of the old version of the cover. But I was like, this cover is a little bit too quiet. It's too staid. Let's amp it up. Okay, this was the result of the Let's Amp It Up, the first round of Let's Amp It Up. And then there were more rounds of Let's Amp It Up with various kinds of mollusks in residence. Somehow, and that was kind of a little bit too sort of loud and so on. So let's amp it down. So here's a few more of these kinds of things, and the type is starting to get a little bit more lively here. And then okay, let's simplify. Always a good thing to do. Okay, we end up with just type and a cellular automaton. Well, okay, a hint of mollusk there occasionally. Okay, so that's it. Those are kind of attractive covers. They're still a little bit quiet. So we're like, let's try more color there. But now we have the cellular automaton and we have the type, and we're starting to have some sort of flow for the type here. Then, okay, there were a few other efforts here of doing different things with the type, but we've definitely got the cellular automaton over on the left there. Okay, so this was around, I think this was probably 93, maybe early 94. This was a time when we were still thinking we weren't going to sign up to publish the book ourselves. We were going to have some standard publishing company publish the book. And so we had interacted with a bunch of kind of publishing companies, and there was a particularly big New York publishing company that had kind of been identified as the front runner for, you know, the publish the book company. And they were like, but we can make great cover designs. Let's prove that we, you know, all the value we can add with all the great cover designs we can make. So we were like, okay, you know, we have a really pretty good art department, and we even had just won some prizes for packaging design, for software packaging. You know, we're going to put a lot of effort into making this cover design because we really care about it and we're prepared to spend money on it and so on. And, you know, it's not, you know, it's probably not really a great use of your time, publishing company, to go and try and make a cover design. No, we're going to make it. It's going to be great. You'll see we're really skilled. We're very expert publishers. We understand everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, what did they produce? This was their cover design. So, you know, maybe if it was a novel read on a beach, maybe, with a mollusk on the beach, maybe, but otherwise it's an F. So then after that, I kind of started thinking about cover designs a bit, and I kind of this was some sketches of mine. This is some awful sketches of some kind of physicalized cover design. I kind of had the idea it would be nice to sort of physicalize the cover in some way. And kind of on this theory that cellular automata could have been discovered by, you know, in Babylonian times, kind of one of the ideas was kind of the stone embossed cellular automaton. And we tried to make this work. We tried to kind of find a stonemason and you know, sort of actually take a photograph of it. Actually, I think we did some experiments, but I couldn't find any of those experiments on that. But the problem was a cellular automaton pattern is already a very detailed pattern. And putting that on top of stone, you barely notice the stone pattern. And so there's no point to that. But somewhere along the way, kind of there arose this idea of kind of the sort of the myth of the idea of the archaeologist goes into the cave and discovers the kind of the cellular automaton pattern, and they've got a flashlight, and that led to this idea of the kind of shaft of light notion of, you know, the cellular automaton pattern illuminated by a shaft of light. Meanwhile, not to be outdone, our friends at the publishing company said, no, we can make it better. This was their effort. So that was not actually the last straw. Maybe I'll tell the story of the last straw with that publishing company. There was still a straw being hung at this point. There was a later story which finally severed that last straw. But in any case, you know, we started experimenting with how do you make something that kind of looks like a shaft of light on a cover like this? It was surprisingly difficult. There was different colors and things, and more variation of typography and so on. And this was, I think, the first time I actually had sort of a mock-up of the book. This was from 1995, I think. Let's see, that was from, July 1995. It already looked like that. Then the cover didn't really change for quite a few years. And towards the very end, we're like doing all these experiments to figure out exactly how do you produce the right effect for the cover. And eventually we wind up with the cover as the cover ended up being. we'd figured out quite early that the spine of the book, that you could have this nice wraparound effect on the spine of the book. And needless to say, the details of how the cover is built are in a note at the back of the book there. Well, gosh, I'd not expected to yak on this long about the making of the book, and I'm probably only about halfway through what I had to say here, and perhaps we should plan to continue another time. But perhaps I'll say a little bit more here, and then I had hoped to talk about both how the book came to be and also sort of where we go from here in terms of the science, and perhaps we shall wait for another week for that. I had picked out in this sort of study of the creation of the book, I kind of went back to backup tapes and so on and tried to look at what was the actual evolution of the opening paragraphs of the book. And it's sort of interesting to see that they go from very kind of complexity themed. I realized very early on that computation was sort of much of the story, but I gradually realized it was the main story, so to speak. And that complexity was a hook, but it wasn't much of a hook. And the real story was, this was the introduction of kind of a computational paradigm. Okay, this is from 1994. It starts off, my goal in this book is not a modest one. I suppose that was a takeoff of the Jim Watson double helix opening line, I suppose. I don't know. I think there's the problem is when you know too many opening lines, you end up imitating them. I'm glad that was not the one that I ended up using. It sort of it ended up. Let's show this one. Let's see, what did we get to here? Yeah, that was 1994. We get 95. Yeah, this gets closer to the final realization of what this is all about. Is kind of the arc of paradigms in science, and kind of what still sort of realizing that this is about sort of changing the paradigm for thinking about how you make models in science, but still hooked on this sort of complexity kind of thing. I think that finally goes away in 1999, with really the emphasis on the computational paradigm. And I think that by 2001, it's gotten into its final form. I think there are book blurbs and things that I found from that was a 1994 book blurb. That's sort of interesting beginning about computation has had a great impact on almost every area of science, but the still greater impact of computational science is yet to come, which was certainly still true at that time and still true probably today. I noticed in the bottom of that blurb, there was an also in progress, a guide to complexity in cellular automata and other simple systems, another 400 pages, which fortunately did not get written. Maybe I'll just describe and then wrap up for today. Kind of, this whole process of writing this book took 10 years. By the end of 1991, I kind of knew that there was this more about this kind of whole arc of kind of the computational paradigm. But then I was like, okay, what can I figure out based on this paradigm? And I kept on turning over other rocks and realizing there's more here, the paradigm fits better, there's more to say. And that process went on for 10 years. I had, at the beginning of that time, I was still somewhat out and about, kind of talking to people. And one of the super frustrating things was people would always say, that sounds very interesting. What about this, this, and this? And I'd think, oh, I should think about that as well. And I kind of quickly realized that that was a very bad thing to do. That, I had my table of contents pretty much. It's just like, just execute that. Stay focused, execute that. Don't kind of chase all these other things that other people say might be interesting. I've got my own path that I think is interesting. And so it's kind of like shut down that external stimulus because I've already got an internal stimulus that's plenty extensive enough. And this was a typical piece of mail that I sent in 1992 that I hope will be finished, I said, by the middle of next year, which turned out not to be correct because too much was discovered. And of course, I have lots of personal analytics data on what I was doing at that time. That's a dot for every piece of email sent during the period from 1989 until present day. And you can kind of see that was my book period. And you can see that the white part is where I was asleep and not sending email. I think many of the glitches here are not me waking up, but they're more like automated computer systems. Some of these are probably me traveling to different parts of the world and being in different time zones. But in any case, this kind of shows during the time I was working on the book, I became deeply, deeply nocturnal. That sort of, I did a shift at the end of working on the book, and I've been much more consistent ever since. And I tried an experiment a few years ago, which, as you can see, has not succeeded. I think I've been a creature of habit for a very long time now in that regard. So this was a sort of this is, I think, let's see, this is 1995, typical kind of setup, computers, printouts. I think that there was a little box intended as a promo box for putting mollusk shells in for some kind of thing. Oh wow, there's the Complex Systems Journal. Huh, interesting to see these things that still look somewhat the same today. The mouse doesn't look the same. Those computers don't look the same anymore. So then, let's see. By this point, this is probably a year later, I still have the same desk, although not in the same place. And I don't have the same computer, but notice the appearance of a webcam is probably in 1994 or 5. A webcam, I didn't use it very often. I always thought people should make kind of decorative webcam stands. I tried to get an artist friend of mine to make those, but never came to be. This must have been probably a year or two later. It's the monitor is thinner. There are small helpers who've arrived, and I'm looking distinctly unkempt, as happens when you play remote CEO working as a hermit on science for a long time. I think this is in 2000. There's an article in Forbes magazine, and this was captured by a photographer from Forbes. This is kind of the caged scientist look. And he actually also got a very nice, this is kind of a still life of the desk setup, although there was sort of a time warp thing here, a wormhole or something, because obviously the book didn't exist yet. Although that was a mock-up of the book. The webcam has become more stylish, even its mounting has become more stylish by that time. And that's actually the other book. That's my book about cellular automata. That's there. And those are quite other books which I still have. I don't know quite why I had those in that location, because I'm not sure they were the most useful. Those are some of the collected works of Leonard Euler. I know those books are. Well, in any case, all right. I think we should probably gosh, I'm so sorry. I really had a quite different plan for today. I didn't realize there was so much material here. I will be happy to go on and talk some more about this next week. What I would like to do is cover more about kind of the making of the NKS book. There's more to say about the process of making and printing and so on. Printing the book, there were a bunch of adventures related to that. People might be interested in what was actually involved in actually producing what was and remains a rather unique kind of unique physical object. And then maybe I'll talk about the lost epilogue from the book. I wrote about this in the thing I just posted, but give you a bit more detail about the lost epilogue that I just rediscovered, that was the epilogue that I had drafted but never put out, which includes some things about expectations for what would happen in the decades to come after the publication of the book. And that's kind of a fun thing to talk about. And then I could talk about what's actually happened. And I think the big picture, maybe I can just show one example here of, let's see, of that. Let's see, this is from the post that I just did today. This is really, this whole story is sort of the big surprise. There's a foundation of NKS, a new kind of science. And then as in terms of my personal journey, I kind of left basic science for 17 years and then came back with the physics project and built on kind of the foundations of new kind of science. And then we're really off and running again. And there's kind of another new paradigm. I mean, the new kind of science is kind of, I view as being sort of the computational paradigm, kind of probably the third paradigm that people have really looked at for ways to understand and model the world. And now, starting 17 years later, it's like the fourth paradigm, this multi-computational paradigm, which is really a whole wonderful, wonderful new set of possibilities. And I maybe talk about the relationship between what's in NKS as sort of a foundation and what comes beyond NKS in this kind of fourth paradigm. It's worth realizing that the paradigms, the sort of structural paradigm from antiquity, the kind of mathematical paradigm from the 1600s, the computational paradigm that's captured in new kind of science, these paradigms are all alive and well. They're all things that are very useful for different kinds of purposes in doing science. And it's interesting to understand now what's now possible with a fourth one of these paradigms, what now becomes possible. And maybe I'll talk some more about that. All right. Well, I think I should wrap up here for today. And oh gosh, I've got I've got to go back to my day job. And I think I have another live stream coming up. I'm amused by a question here about, do people think that the book, New Kind of Science, are they more convinced by it now than they were 20 years ago? What I said at the end of the preface to New Kind of Science is, a lot of the things that are in this book will seem kind of shocking today. In time, they will seem obvious. We're definitely rolling down the seeming obvious hill, at least for younger generations of researchers. And I think that the only really kind of, no, it can't possibly be true crowd, when New Kind of Science first came out 20 years ago, if you look, and I did this recently, I was sort of surprised to realize it, the only people who were negative about it were physicists, which was bizarre because that was a community that I was pretty familiar with, and they were pretty familiar with me, and they all use our technology. And I think it is the ultimate irony that the next big stage in the development of this sort of arc of science is precisely the result of realizing, gosh, those things that we were thinking about physics being computational, it really was true. So in fact, it's sort of an interesting thing that in a sense, it's often a good sign for a new paradigm or for science when people come out with their pitchforks, because it means that there's really something new and different going on. And I think it's an interesting irony that the place where the pitchforks were most out was in physics, which is precisely the thing. In a sense, I suppose if one is to be charitable, and I always like to be, one could say that the pitchforks were right. It wasn't all in NKS. The story of physics, not that I claimed that it was, I thought of physics in NKS as kind of a sort of a sideshow to the book. I thought the main thrust of the book was this kind of computational paradigm applied to all kinds of systems. And I didn't think that I had sort of nailed the fundamental physics area, although I thought that there was an interesting direction to pursue. And I think it's interesting that what, the charitable thing to say would be, no, NKS did not nail the story of physics. NKS provided an underpinning that was necessary for getting there, and it also provided some kind of thoughts about how you might get there, but it did not get there, and nor did it claim to get there. And I think that the reaction of physicists, a few physicists, most of whom are dead now, actually, the most prominent ones, the reaction there was kind of, I think, a very charitable version of it would be, yes, guys, it's true that I didn't solve the fundamental theory of physics in NKS. That was not its point. And while I gave some indications that should have been interesting and should have been pursued, but were not, and it fell back to me to pursue those. And what's been really interesting is the pursuit of those is what's led us to our whole physics project, to this whole multi-computational paradigm, and so on. And I'm happy to say that the reaction to the arrival of these ideas in these years has been, among the physics community, has been really very good, very different from the reaction 20 years ago. I think that's probably more a sign of the dynamics of the physics community than it is a sign of the character of the ideas. But it is really quite interesting that the place that was the sort of the attack vector, insofar as there was one, the pitchfork vector, was all about physics. And physics is exactly what we now managed to make a breakthrough based on the ideas of a new kind of science. And frankly, any of those people who were kind of pitchforking, had they ingested those ideas properly, could very well have been the ones to make that next step. But they chose instead to be out with their pitchforks, which is a thing that happens. It is a sign of paradigm shifts that there are folks out with pitchforks. All right. I think we're going to have to leave it to the 25th anniversary. I've been meaning to really go through and dissect all the things that people said about new kind of science. A lot of it was very nice and very positive, and actually some of the more positive things that was said, at least the sort of headlines and so on, have turned out to be remarkably accurate, and have turned out to be remarkably perceptive. Actually, I mean, I noted when we did the physics project that the review of New Kind of Science in the New York Times had both a headline and a cartoon that kind of indicated the sort of the potential horror of existing scientists. And I hadn't really internalized that, but that review was a very correct kind of analysis of what NKS brought and what was new about it, and what was kind of a difference from existing science, and I think well captured that. And it was interesting that I would say the vast majority of things people said were of that kind. One day it will just be one of those footnotes to the history of science that, oh, there were these people with pitchforks. But maybe on the 25th anniversary, I'll go and really analyze the pitchforks and take them apart. We'll see what. Unfortunately, some of the people with the shiniest pitchforks are no longer alive. So I did, in fact, at the 10th anniversary, I did invite some of those people to a discussion, but none of them came. So it goes. Perhaps that tells one something right there. All right, time to wrap up. See you another time. I will go on with the discussion of the making of the book, and then talk about the arc of development since that time. All right, well, bye for now.